They came back in the middle of dinner, 3 black SUVs with fake enforcement decals, engines like thunder. And they rammed Grandpa Frank's fence like they wanted to erase 50 years of our life. I held my phone, watched wood explode through the air, and saw my grandfather's shoulder bloom red with blood. I thought then, how does a neighborhood board become a gang? My name is Emily Carter, and it started stupidly. Small, a citation slipped through the mail, a laminated notice on the gate, a man in a Navy-style jacket barking about property inspections. We live on county land 10 miles from Pinebrook Estates. Our address is on the right side of every deed. Grandpa Frank Miller has lived here his whole life. He designed bridges for the Department of Transportation. He drinks coffee at 5 a.m. and reads old blueprints like bedtime stories. When a guy in a uniform that looked bought from the wrong website told him he owed fees, Frank squinted and said what made sense. "We don't belong to your HOA." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The notices kept coming. Tall grass violation, unapproved structure. Then late-night knocks, then a shredded piece of fence, then an invoice for $1,500 shoved over the rail like it was charity. I started recording everything 15 clips over 2 weeks because fear is easier to share than to fight. Each video stacked up in a folder called Evidence, and in the bottom of my chest the panic turned into a map because patterns tell you what randomness hides, same format, same vans, the same lady's voice on the megaphone later that I'd see in pictures. The pattern said this was deliberate. When they came the night they broke the fence, it turned into something else. Headlights carved the yard. The driver backed with a precision that made my skin crawl. Splinters hit the window where I had been standing. Grandpa pulled me away with his good arm, and then, like an old machine, he measured the angle of the hit with his eyes. They did this before, he said, and there was something cold in his face I'd never seen. Then she stepped out Karen Hawkins' Pinebrook HOA president pink suit designer bag and a voice that had been practiced to sound like law. She dropped a demand at our feet and smiled like she'd fed a dog. Police told us it was a civil matter. 911 said we could file a report in the morning. When official systems shrug, fear grows teeth. But the next morning the hurt turned into a ledger. Grandpa, who's always kept his pencil sharp, started tallying things in a way that made the theft visible. Odd purchases from buyers' properties sold under pressure. Elderly owners who were suddenly moved out. The more we dug, the worse it looked. It wasn't just harassment, it read like a playbook. Fake enforcement teams, faux credentials, pattern of harassment cycles that squeezed people until they either paid monthly fees or sold their homes at 1/10 of what they were worth. It had a rhythm, and we were finally learning the beat. At first I wanted to run. There was a night I sat on our step with Duke, our golden retriever, and thought maybe we'd done everything wrong, maybe we should have kept our heads down, paid whatever they wanted, or moved away while we could. The videos on my phone felt useless sometimes, like a child's diary. I felt stupid for filming. I felt weak for needing help. I remember telling myself out loud that maybe we were overreacting, that perhaps this whole thing was a complicated legal stew we hadn't understood. It was awful to consider that maybe I'd misjudged it all, that my grandfather had misjudged it, and that our stubbornness was vanity. That doubt nearly swallowed me. Then, the internet did what the county wouldn't, it multiplied our voice. I edited 15 clips into one short compilation and posted it to the community page with a desperate title, Fake HOA Scam, Please Share. Within a day, thousands had watched. Within 2 days, people were writing that they recognized the same vans, the same enforcement script. A private group formed, victims of fake HOA scams, and messages rolled in like waves. A woman named Sarah said her mother had been paying $300 a month for a year and was too ashamed to tell her kids. Another commenter said her grandfather sold his house after repeated harassment. And then a message I didn't expect. My sister is County Commissioner Helen Brooks. I'm sending this to her right now. Helen called Grandpa 2 hours later, voice tight, telling us her own mother had been targeted. That call changed the temperature. When an elected official hears a story and loses sleep over it, it starts moving. Helen opened a case file and suddenly our evidence folder wasn't just a sad archive. It was a trail. Neighbors came forward. Bill Turner, our contractor neighbor, walked the yard and said out loud what we'd been feeling. "This looks like organized extortion." He read the invoices, the hit patterns, and his jaw set the way it does when he sees poor workmanship, uncaring and intentional. Grandpa didn't cry. He does math. He drew diagrams, made spreadsheets, and for the first time since the first hit, he was calmly furious. He had spent 35 years designing protective structures, bridges, security barriers. That night, he opened an old program on his laptop and started sketching. "If they won't be stopped by law, we'll let physics do it," he said. Half smiling, and in that sentence my frustration sharpened into something dangerous hope. We were careful. We wanted to build something legal and defensible, not a booby trap. We mounted cameras, put up warning signs, and coordinated with Helen and a legal team so our actions couldn't be twisted into provocation. Word spread. People donated material. Contractors offered time. Retired engineers brought tools. It felt like the community remembered how to help. Building together became a kind of therapy. We explained not to hurt anyone but to protect ourselves, and everyone brought their corner of expertise. Grandpa supervised while I learned about torque and angle in language that was less science class, more survival. When Karen showed up that morning with 3 SUVs, I could feel every person there tighten. She rolled out in full costume sash, fake crown megaphone like a prop, and called for compliance. "Pay up, or we will enforce," she shouted. For a moment I thought she might be bluffing. Then engines revved. The first SUV struck a corner and crumpled like tin. The driver stumbled out shell-shocked. The second car, Karen's vehicle, came like a comet, and for a breath the world was only vibration and sound. The steel we had installed leaned in a way designed to return force. The impact physics did exactly what Grandpa promised. The SUV bucked, shot backward, spun, and threw its people out into dust and airbag residue. Karen's crown came off and tumbled into our garden like the punchline of a terrible joke. I streamed everything. My hands shook the whole time. People on the feed were screaming not in terror, but because they watched a system finally fail. The third vehicle hit and disabled itself too. It was messy and loud and not pretty. It was also decisive. Karen's team scattered some collapsing in the dirt, some standing in stunned silence. A few of the men who had driven those cars, hired hands, scared money seekers, immediately started cooperating, admitting everything, offering messages, payments, texts, bank transfers that tied back to Karen's shell company. The sheriff arrived, and so did a prosecutor with files that made Karen's empire look like a small, sinister corporation. The evidence, our videos, witness statements from elderly victims' bank records suddenly fit together like a jigsaw. Charges were read. They handcuffed her in front of the fence she had tried to destroy. I remember the clack of metal on her wrists, and a silence so complete I could hear Duke breathing. I felt no glee, just a long, exhausted gratitude. Justice looked different than I'd imagined. It was not a banner and a parade. It was a set of papers on a table, a judge's pen, the slow machinery of law catching up to cruelty. When they led her away, the cameras kept rolling. People who had been silenced for years stepped forward to give statements. Money was traced and restitution ordered. The federal system pulled threads and found a net fraud extortion conspiracy. It was bigger than us, but it started with our refusal to be quiet. I still have doubts sometimes about choices made in haste about the line between defense and retaliation. I won't pretend everything was perfect. We could have been hurt worse. We were terrified the whole time. But I also know this standing alone is easier to break than standing together. We learned that when fear arrived, disguised as authority, community, and evidence are the antidotes. The last thing I remember that day is Grandpa sitting in a folding chair, shoulder-braced, watching the fence like a man who had finished an important blueprint. He put his hand on mine and said quietly, "Physics doesn't negotiate." I looked at the ruined SUVs, scattered like discarded toys, and at the cameras that had recorded it all, and I thought about every neighbor who had finally said enough. Lesson: when law fails community and truth still have power.